The morning mist clung to the stone walls of Windsor Castle like a shroud, and Sergeant Major James Mitchell felt the weight of 23 years of military service pressing against his chest as he adjusted his ceremonial uniform. The red tunic, pristine and adorned with medals earned through deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, felt heavier than usual. His boots, polished to mirror perfection, clicked against the ancient cobblestones as he made his way to the guardhouse for what would become the most consequential day of his career. At 45 years old, Mitchell had dedicated his entire adult life to serving the crown. He had joined the Welsh Guard straight from secondary school, driven by a deep sense of duty instilled by his grandfather, who had served in World War II. The military had given him purpose, structure, and a clear moral compass that had guided him through the darkest moments of combat and the mundane routines of peacetime service. He had never questioned an order, never wavered in his loyalty, and never imagined that his unwavering principles would one day put him at odds with the very institution he had sworn to protect. The castle was buzzing with unusual activity that Tuesday morning in late October. King Charles III was scheduled to arrive for a private ceremony honoring veterans of recent conflicts, and the entire royal household was working with clockwork precision to ensure everything proceeded flawlessly. Mitchell had participated in dozens of such events over his career, but something felt different about this one. Perhaps it was the recent controversies surrounding the monarchy, or maybe it was the growing unrest among military personnel over budget cuts and inadequate support for veterans. Whatever the reason, an undercurrent of tension seemed to permeate the ancient walls. As the senior non-commissioned officer present, Mitchell was responsible for ensuring his men understood their duties and maintained the highest standards of military bearing. He had briefed them the night before, emphasizing the importance of protocol and the honor they represented not just as soldiers but as guardians of British tradition. Yet even as he spoke those familiar words, a nagging doubt had begun to form in the back of his mind. The source of his internal conflict lay in a conversation he had overheard 3 days earlier while waiting outside the colonel's office. Two senior officers had been discussing the king's recent comments about military spending, comments that seemed to dismiss the sacrifices made by soldiers and their families. One officer had mentioned how His Majesty had reportedly laughed when presented with statistics about veteran homelessness, suggesting that former soldiers should simply pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Mitchell had lost too many friends to post-traumatic stress and suicide to find anything amusing about such struggles. The memory of his closest friend, Corporal David Thompson, haunted Mitchell daily. Thompson had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, had saved Mitchell's life during an ambush in Helmand Province, and had returned home a broken man. The military had failed him. The veterans' services had failed him, and ultimately, Thompson had taken his own life in a shabby bedsit in Birmingham, alone and forgotten by the very system he had served with distinction. Mitchell had spoken at Thompson's funeral, promising his friend's widow and children that he would never forget the sacrifice, never stop fighting for those who had given everything for their country. Now, as he prepared to stand in formation before the king, Mitchell felt the weight of that promise. How could he bow his head in deference to a man who apparently held veterans in such low regard? How could he participate in a ceremony celebrating military service when the guest of honor seemed to view soldiers as expendable commodities? The conflict between his duty as a soldier and his conscience as a human being had been growing for days, and he knew that something would have to give. The other guards were already assembled when Mitchell arrived at the main courtyard. 32 of the finest soldiers in the British Army stood in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing proud and professional. Many of them were young men who looked up to Mitchell as both a leader and a father figure. They trusted him implicitly, and he knew that whatever decision he made would affect not just his own career, but potentially theirs as well. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer, approached Mitchell with a slight frown creasing his weathered features. Harrison was old-school military, a man who believed in tradition above all else, and had little patience for anything that might disrupt the smooth functioning of ceremonial duties. He had served alongside Mitchell for 8 years and respected his professionalism, but he also knew that the Sergeant Major had been troubled by something in recent weeks. "Everything in order, Sergeant Major?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying the authority of command but also a note of genuine concern. "Yes, sir," Mitchell replied automatically, though his internal turmoil continued to rage. The men are ready for inspection. Harrison nodded and moved down the line, examining each guard with the practiced eye of a career soldier. Mitchell watched him work, remembering the countless times they had stood together in similar formations, preparing for events that celebrated the pomp and circumstance of military life. But today felt different. Today, the pageantry seemed hollow, a beautiful facade covering an ugly reality. As the minutes ticked by, Mitchell found his thoughts drifting to his son, Robert, who was currently serving with the Parachute Regiment in Eastern Europe. Robert had joined the military against his mother's wishes, but with his father's blessing, driven by the same sense of duty that had motivated Mitchell decades earlier. What kind of world was Robert fighting to protect? What kind of leadership was he expected to respect and follow? The questions gnawed at Mitchell, adding another layer to his mounting distress. The sound of approaching vehicles announced the imminent arrival of the royal party. Mitchell straightened his shoulders and focused on the immediate task at hand, but his mind continued to race. He thought about the oath he had taken as a young soldier, pledging to serve Queen and country. Elizabeth II had been on the throne then, a monarch who had earned the respect and affection of her military through decades of unwavering support and genuine care for those who served. Charles was different. His relationship with the armed forces had always been more distant, more transactional. A trumpet fanfare echoed across the courtyard, and Mitchell felt his heart begin to pound. The moment of truth was approaching, and he still had no idea what he would do when faced with the choice between duty and conscience. Part of him hoped that the king's presence would somehow resolve his doubts, that seeing the man in person would remind him of the larger principles he had sworn to uphold. But another part of him, the part that remembered Thompson's haunted eyes and the widow's tears, wondered if some principles were more important than others. The royal convoy pulled into the courtyard with practiced precision, and Mitchell could see the distinctive figure of King Charles III emerging from the lead vehicle. The king was dressed in civilian clothes, having chosen not to wear military uniform for this particular event, which somehow made the moment feel even more surreal. Here was a man who would never face enemy fire, never sleep in a muddy foxhole, never watch a comrade die in his arms, yet he held ultimate authority over those who had experienced all of these things. As the king approached the formation, Mitchell's mind flashed back to a conversation with his father, now deceased, who had served in the Royal Navy during the Falklands War. His father had once told him that a soldier's greatest duty was not to any individual, no matter how exalted their position, but to the principles and values that made their service meaningful. Never bow to tyranny, his father had said, even when it wears a crown. The words echoed in Mitchell's mind as he watched the king drawing closer, flanked by his security detail and various palace officials. The moment was almost upon him, and Sergeant Major James Mitchell, veteran of foreign wars and guardian of British tradition, realized that he was about to make a decision that would change his life forever. The formation stood at attention, 33 men ready to render honors to their sovereign. But in the mind of one experienced soldier, a different kind of battle was about to begin, one that would test not just his courage under fire, but his willingness to stand for what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences. The king was now only 20 paces away, and Mitchell could feel the eyes of his fellow soldiers upon him, trusting him to lead by example as he had done for over 2 decades. The weight of their expectations combined with the burden of his own convictions created a pressure that seemed to compress his very soul. In a few more seconds, he would have to choose between the comfort of conformity and the courage of his convictions. Time seemed to slow as the king approached, and Mitchell found himself thinking one final time about David Thompson, about his son Robert, about all the soldiers who had trusted him to represent their interests and honor their sacrifices. The moment of decision had arrived, and there was no longer any time for doubt or hesitation. Whatever happened next would define not just the rest of his career, but the rest of his life. The moment arrived with the inevitability of dawn. King Charles III stepped before the formation, his presence commanding the attention of every person in the courtyard. The protocol was clear and had been rehearsed countless times. When the monarch approached, all military personnel would bow their heads in a gesture of respect and submission. It was a tradition stretching back centuries, a symbolic acknowledgement of the chain of command that placed the crown at the apex of British military authority. 32 heads bowed in perfect unison. One did not. Sergeant Major James Mitchell stood ramrod straight, his eyes fixed firmly ahead, meeting the gaze of the king with unwavering resolve. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum of sound that seemed to suck the air from the courtyard. Mitchell could feel the shock radiating from his fellow soldiers, could sense the confusion and mounting horror of the palace officials. But he did not waver. This was his line in the sand, his moment of truth. King Charles paused mid-stride, his expression shifting from polite ceremonial interest to surprise, then to something resembling indignation. For a man accustomed to the automatic deference of everyone around him, the sight of a soldier refusing to bow was jarring and unprecedented. The king's security detail immediately tensed, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons, though they quickly realized that this was not a physical threat, but something far more complex and potentially damaging. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's face went white, then red with embarrassment and rage. In his 30-year career, he had never witnessed such a breach of protocol, such a public humiliation of both himself and the institution he represented. His mind raced through the immediate implications, the damage to regimental reputation, the questions that would be asked, the investigations that would follow. But beyond the professional concerns, he felt a personal sense of betrayal. Mitchell had been his most trusted non-commissioned officer, a man whose judgment and loyalty he had never questioned. The other soldiers remained frozen in their positions, heads still bowed, unsure whether to maintain protocol or react to the unprecedented situation unfolding beside them. Some of them, particularly the younger ones, felt a surge of confusion and conflicted emotions. They respected Mitchell enormously and knew him to be a man of integrity, which made his actions all the more bewildering. Why would their sergeant major choose this moment, this public forum, to make what could only be interpreted as a political statement? King Charles recovered his composure with the practiced ease of a man born to public scrutiny. He had faced protests, hecklers, and hostile crowds throughout his decades as heir apparent, and while this situation was unique in its intimacy and symbolic weight, he understood the importance of maintaining dignity in the face of challenge. He stepped closer to Mitchell, close enough that their conversation would not be overheard by the media representatives positioned at the edge of the courtyard. "Sergeant Major," the king said, his voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and steel, "you seem to have forgotten your manners." Mitchell's response came without hesitation, his voice clear and respectful, but absolutely firm. "Your Majesty, I have not forgotten my manners. Nor have I forgotten my duty. I simply cannot bow to a man who shows such disregard for the soldiers who have sacrificed everything in service to this nation." The words hung in the air like a challenge to single combat. King Charles's eyes narrowed slightly, and Mitchell could see the royal temper beginning to flare. This was not a man accustomed to being lectured by anyone, let alone a non-commissioned officer whose entire career depended on royal favor. The king's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, audible only to Mitchell and perhaps Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had moved closer to try to contain the damage. "You dare to question my commitment to the armed forces?" King Charles hissed. "I have been patron of dozens of military charities, have visited troops in the field, have supported veterans' causes throughout my life. Who are you to judge my dedication?" Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for a moment, his carefully maintained military bearing threatened to crack. The king's words struck him as the height of privileged hypocrisy, the protests of a man who had never faced real danger or genuine hardship attempting to claim moral authority over those who had. When Mitchell spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every fallen comrade, every broken veteran, every family destroyed by the aftermath of service. "With respect, Your Majesty, charity galas and photo opportunities are not the same as genuine understanding or support. 3 days ago, I heard you laugh about veteran homelessness and suggest that former soldiers should simply pull themselves up by their bootstraps. My best friend, Corporal David Thompson, served 3 tours in Afghanistan and saved my life in Helmand Province. When he came home, the system failed him completely. He died alone in a Birmingham bedsit, forgotten and abandoned by the very nation he had defended. I cannot bow to someone who finds such suffering amusing." The king's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, Mitchell could not tell. The accusation was serious and specific enough to be verifiable, which made it dangerous. If word of this exchange reached the media, it could cause significant damage to the monarchy's carefully cultivated image as supporters of military personnel. King Charles glanced around quickly, noting the positions of photographers and reporters, calculating the potential for damage control. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison stepped forward, his voice urgent and pleading. Your Majesty, I apologize profusely for this unprecedented breach of protocol. Sergeant Major Mitchell has been under considerable stress recently, and I'm certain he doesn't mean to show disrespect to the Crown. Perhaps we could continue with the ceremony and address this matter privately afterward. But Mitchell would not be silenced or dismissed. He had crossed the Rubicon, and there was no retreat available to him now. His voice rose slightly, not to a shout but to a level that would carry to the other soldiers in the formation, men who had the right to hear the truth about the choice they were being asked to make. I mean every word I've said, sir, Mitchell declared, his gaze still locked on the king's face. I swore an oath to serve Queen and country, to defend the realm and protect those who cannot protect themselves. I did not swear to enable the casual dismissal of suffering or to pretend that ceremony and tradition are more important than justice and compassion. If standing for those principles makes me a traitor in the eyes of the Crown, then I accept that judgment. The courtyard fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the harsh breathing of men struggling to process what they were witnessing. Some of the younger soldiers were beginning to raise their heads, drawn by the magnetic pull of the confrontation and unable to maintain their deferential postures while such momentous words were being spoken. They looked between Mitchell and the king with expressions of confusion, admiration, and growing awareness that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after they had all left the service. King Charles seemed to recognize that he was losing control of the narrative. The longer this confrontation continued, the more dangerous it became for the monarchy. He needed to reassert his authority quickly and decisively, to make it clear that such insubordination would not be tolerated and that the natural order would be preserved. When he spoke again, his voice carried the full weight of royal displeasure and the implicit threat of consequences that would extend far beyond Mitchell's military career. Sergeant Major Mitchell, you are clearly unfit for the honor of serving in the Royal Guard. Your commanding officer will see that you are removed from this duty immediately and face appropriate disciplinary action. Your behavior today is a disgrace to the uniform you wear and the tradition you represent. Mitchell nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting exactly this response. There was no surprise in his expression, no regret or second thoughts visible in his bearing. He had known the cost of his stand before he made it, and he was prepared to pay that price. His voice, when he spoke again, carried a note of sad finality. Your Majesty is correct. I am unfit to serve a crown that places its own dignity above the lives and welfare of those who defend it. I request permission to be relieved of this duty. The formal language of military courtesy could not disguise the rebellion at the heart of Mitchell's words. He was not asking for mercy or forgiveness. He was demanding to be released from an obligation that he now viewed as morally compromised. The request was shocking in its implications, suggesting that the problem lay not with Mitchell's behavior, but with the institution he was rejecting. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice cracked with strain as he attempted to restore some semblance of military order to the situation. Sergeant Major Mitchell, you will report to my office immediately following this ceremony for disciplinary action. Your relief will be arranged within the hour. But even as the words were spoken, everyone present understood that the real damage had already been done. Mitchell had successfully challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying the relationship between the monarchy and the military. He had suggested, in the most public way possible, that loyalty should be conditional on moral leadership, and that soldiers had not just the right, but the duty, to refuse participation in institutions that betrayed their values. The ceremony continued, but the mood had been irreversibly altered. King Charles proceeded through his planned remarks and interactions with mechanical precision, but his words about honor, duty, and service rang hollow in the wake of Mitchell's challenge. The other soldiers performed their duties correctly, but with noticeably less enthusiasm, their minds clearly occupied by what they had witnessed. As the royal party prepared to depart, King Charles paused for one final exchange with Mitchell, who remained at attention despite his obvious dismissal from royal favor. The king's voice was quiet, but filled with the promise of consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate moment. You have chosen a very dangerous path, Sergeant Major. I hope you are prepared for where it leads. Mitchell's response was equally quiet, but unwavering in its conviction. Your Majesty, I chose the only path my conscience would allow. If that makes me dangerous, then I accept that judgment as well." As the royal convoy departed, leaving behind a courtyard full of shocked and confused soldiers, Sergeant Major James Mitchell stood alone at the center of a storm that was only beginning to gather strength. The news spread through military circles with the speed and devastation of wildfire. Within hours of the confrontation at Windsor Castle, word of Sergeant Major Mitchell's unprecedented act of defiance had reached every major military installation in the United Kingdom. Social media amplified the story, with grainy cell phone footage from palace staff and visitors providing just enough visual evidence to confirm what many had initially dismissed as impossible rumors. By evening, the incident had transcended military gossip and become a national sensation. Mitchell found himself confined to quarters pending a formal court-martial, but his isolation did not protect him from the storm of consequences his actions had unleashed. His mobile phone buzzed constantly with calls from journalists, military colleagues, and complete strangers who had somehow obtained his number. Some wanted to offer support, others to condemn him. But all were desperate to understand what could drive a decorated veteran to commit what many viewed as career suicide in the most public way possible. The Ministry of Defense worked frantically to contain the damage, issuing carefully worded statements about the importance of military discipline and the unfortunate behavior of an individual who did not represent the views or values of the armed forces. But their efforts at damage control were undermined by a steady stream of leaks from military personnel who had witnessed the confrontation or heard detailed accounts from those who had. Each new revelation added fuel to a fire that threatened to consume not just Mitchell's career, but the carefully maintained image of royal military relations. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison found himself in an impossible position, caught between his duty to maintain discipline and his genuine respect for Mitchell as a soldier and leader. In his 30 years of service, he had never faced a situation so fraught with political and institutional implications. The pressure from above was intense and unrelenting. Mitchell needed to be made an example of, his actions condemned so thoroughly that no other soldier would dare to follow his lead. But Harrison also understood the deeper issues that had driven Mitchell to his breaking point. Issues that resonated throughout the military community. The response from Mitchell's fellow soldiers was complex and divided. Many of the younger troops, particularly those who had served in recent conflicts, found themselves quietly sympathetic to his position. They had experienced firsthand the disconnect between the rhetoric of support for military families and the reality of inadequate housing, insufficient mental health services, and bureaucratic indifference to veteran concerns. Mitchell's stand, however dramatic and dangerous, gave voice to frustrations they had been feeling but had never dared to express. The older, more senior non-commissioned officers were generally appalled by what they saw as a fundamental betrayal of military values. They had built their careers on unquestioning obedience to lawful authority and viewed Mitchell's actions as a dangerous precedent that could undermine the entire foundation of military discipline. Many of them had served alongside Mitchell and respected his record, which made his apparent fall from grace all the more shocking and disturbing. Perhaps the most complex response came from the officer corps, who found themselves struggling to balance their institutional loyalty with their professional assessment of Mitchell's grievances. Several senior officers privately acknowledged that the sergeant major had raised legitimate concerns about royal attitudes toward military personnel, but they were equally convinced that his methods were disastrously counterproductive. The military was not a democracy, they argued. It was an institution built on hierarchy and discipline, and those foundations could not be compromised without risking the effectiveness of the entire system. The media coverage was relentless and increasingly polarized. Conservative outlets portrayed Mitchell as a dangerous radical who had betrayed his oath and disgraced his uniform, a man whose actions represented the worst kind of political activism masquerading as principled dissent. Progressive publications, on the other hand, celebrated him as a whistleblower and truth-teller who had exposed the hollow nature of royal support for military personnel. The competing narratives reflected deeper divisions in British society about the role of the monarchy, the nature of duty, and the rights of individual conscience. Meanwhile, behind the walls of Buckingham Palace, King Charles and his advisors were grappling with a crisis that threatened to spiral beyond their control. The specific allegations Mitchell had made about royal comments regarding veteran homelessness were particularly dangerous because they contained just enough truth to be credible. The king had indeed made remarks that could be interpreted as callous or dismissive, though they had been intended as private observations rather than public policy statements. The royal household found itself in the uncomfortable position of neither being able to fully deny the allegations nor to adequately explain the context in which the comments had been made. The palace's initial strategy focused on character assassination, with anonymous sources suggesting that Mitchell was mentally unstable, politically motivated, or seeking personal gain through his dramatic gesture. But this approach backfired when Mitchell's military record became public knowledge, revealing a soldier whose service had been exemplary and whose decorations for valor made claims of instability or cowardice impossible to sustain. The palace was forced to shift tactics, emphasizing the importance of institutional respect while avoiding direct attacks on Mitchell's character or service. As the days passed, Mitchell's confinement became increasingly surreal. He was housed in a small room on a military base, technically under arrest, but treated more like a prisoner of war than a criminal. His meals were delivered by soldiers who often lingered to express their support or confusion about the situation. Some brought letters from their families. Others shared their own stories of frustration with military leadership or royal indifference. Mitchell began to realize that his individual act of defiance had tapped into a much broader well of discontent than he had ever imagined. The most difficult aspect of his situation was the impact on his family. His wife, Sarah, had initially been supportive of his decision, understanding the moral crisis that had driven him to act. But as the media attention intensified and the professional consequences became clear, she began to worry about their financial security and their son's future in the military. Robert, still serving with the parachute regiment, found himself subjected to intense scrutiny from his commanding officers and colleagues, all of whom wondered whether he shared his father's rebellious tendencies. The stress on the family was compounded by the constant presence of journalists outside their home, eager for any additional details about Mitchell's background or motivations. Sarah was forced to take leave from her job as a primary school teacher to avoid the disruption her presence was causing, while Robert faced an impossible choice between defending his father's actions and maintaining his own military career. The personal cost of Mitchell's stand was beginning to exact a toll that extended far beyond his own professional prospects. Support for Mitchell came from unexpected quarters. A group of military families who had lost loved ones in recent conflicts issued a statement praising his courage and calling for a genuine investigation into royal attitudes toward military personnel. Several members of parliament, including some from the governing party, raised questions about the treatment of veterans and the accountability of unelected officials who held positions of authority over military personnel. Even some retired senior officers, speaking carefully but pointedly, suggested that Mitchell's concerns deserved serious consideration rather than summary dismissal. The government found itself caught in the middle of an increasingly bitter conflict between competing visions of military duty and royal authority. The Prime Minister's office issued statements supporting both the monarchy and the military, while carefully avoiding any direct comment on Mitchell's specific allegations. Behind the scenes, however, government officials were working frantically to broker some kind of resolution that would allow all parties to claim victory, while minimizing long-term damage to key institutions. The court-martial proceedings were scheduled to begin within 2 weeks, and both sides were preparing for a confrontation that would likely determine not just Mitchell's fate, but the broader relationship between military personnel and the royal family. Mitchell's military-appointed lawyer was competent but clearly uncomfortable with the political implications of the case, while the prosecution was building a straightforward case focused on breach of military discipline and failure to follow lawful orders. As Mitchell sat in his small room reviewing the charges against him and preparing for the fight of his life, he reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. The memory of David Thompson's funeral remained fresh in his mind, along with the promise he had made to never forget the sacrifices of those who had served. He thought about his son facing an uncertain future in an institution that might no longer have room for soldiers with inconvenient consciences. He thought about the thousands of veterans struggling with inadequate support and indifferent leadership, men and women who had given everything for a country that seemed increasingly unwilling to give anything back. The consequences of his actions were becoming clear, and they were more severe than even he had anticipated. His career was finished, his family was under siege, and his future was uncertain. But as he sat alone with his thoughts, Mitchell found that he felt no regret about the choice he had made. The world needed to know the truth about the gap between royal rhetoric and royal reality, and if he was the only one willing to pay the price for speaking that truth, then so be it. The battle lines were being drawn for a confrontation that would test not just the limits of military discipline, but the very nature of moral authority in a constitutional monarchy. Mitchell had fired the first shot in a war that would determine whether individual conscience could ever trump institutional loyalty, and the outcome of that war would shape the British military for generations to come. The courtroom at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst had been transformed into an arena where competing visions of military duty would clash with unprecedented intensity. The court-martial of Sergeant Major James Mitchell had attracted international attention, with media representatives from around the world descending on the normally quiet military installation. Security was unprecedented, with armed guards checking credentials and scanning for weapons or recording devices that might compromise the proceedings. Mitchell entered the courtroom in dress uniform, his chest adorned with the medals that testified to 2 decades of exemplary service. Despite the charges against him and the certainty of professional ruin, he maintained the bearing of a professional soldier, his spine straight and his eyes focused ahead. The contrast between his decorated past and his uncertain future was not lost on the assembled observers, many of whom struggled to reconcile the image of a rebel with that of a man who had clearly embodied military virtues throughout his career. The prosecution case was led by Colonel Margaret Thornbury, a formidable lawyer-soldier whose reputation for thoroughness and legal precision had earned her respect throughout the military justice system. She had been chosen specifically for this case because of her ability to separate legal issues from political considerations, though she understood perfectly well that the two were inextricably linked in this particular matter. Her opening statement was crisp, professional, and devastating in its simplicity. "Members of the court," Colonel Thornbury began, her voice carrying the authority of law and precedent. "This case is fundamentally about military discipline and the chain of command that makes effective military service possible. The accused, Sergeant Major Mitchell, willfully and publicly refused to render proper respect to His Majesty King Charles III, in direct violation of military law and custom. His motivations, however noble he may consider them to be, are irrelevant to the legal question before us. A soldier who picks and chooses which orders to follow is not a soldier at all, but a danger to military effectiveness and unit cohesion." The colonel methodically laid out the evidence. Witness testimony from the 32 other soldiers present at the ceremony, photographic evidence of Mitchell's refusal to bow, and recordings of his subsequent statements to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison and other military personnel. She emphasized the public nature of the offense, arguing that Mitchell had deliberately chosen the most damaging possible forum for his act of defiance. The damage to military discipline, she contended, could not be measured simply by the immediate disruption, but must include the precedent it set for future challenges to lawful authority. Mitchell's defense was handled by Major Anthony Caldwell, a young officer who had volunteered for the assignment despite clear warnings that it could damage his own career prospects. Caldwell had studied the case for weeks, wrestling with the complex intersection of military law, constitutional authority, and individual conscience. His defense strategy was risky and unprecedented. He would argue that Mitchell's actions, while technically in violation of military protocol, were justified by higher moral principles that trumped narrow legal requirements. "Members of the court," Major Caldwell said as he rose to present his opening statement, "this case asks us to consider whether a soldier's duty ends with blind obedience to authority, or whether it includes a responsibility to uphold the moral principles that make military service meaningful." Sergeant Major Mitchell served this nation with distinction for 23 years, facing enemy fire, saving lives, and mentoring young soldiers. He is not a rebel or a troublemaker, but a man whose conscience would not allow him to participate in what he viewed as a mockery of the sacrifices made by military personnel. The defense strategy involved calling a series of character witnesses who testified to Mitchell's exemplary service record and his genuine concern for the welfare of his fellow soldiers. Comrades from Afghanistan and Iraq spoke about his leadership under fire and his dedication to bringing everyone home safely. The widow of Corporal David Thompson took the stand to describe her husband's struggles and Mitchell's efforts to help him navigate the inadequate veteran support system. Her emotional testimony about Thompson's suicide and Mitchell's presence at the funeral provided devastating context for his later actions. Perhaps the most compelling testimony came from Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, a military psychiatrist who had treated hundreds of veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. She spoke about the epidemic of veteran suicides, the inadequate funding for mental health services, and the systematic failures that had led to preventable tragedies. Her expert opinion was that Mitchell's reaction to perceived royal indifference was not only understandable, but represented a healthy response to an intolerable moral situation. Military personnel are trained to follow orders, Dr. Morrison explained to the court, but they are also trained to distinguish between lawful and unlawful commands, between moral and immoral actions. When Sergeant Major Mitchell heard what he believed were dismissive comments about veteran suffering, his refusal to bow was not an act of rebellion, but an act of moral courage. To punish him for upholding the values that military service is supposed to represent would be to punish virtue itself. The prosecution's case was methodical and legally sound, but it began to encounter unexpected obstacles when several witnesses expressed sympathy for Mitchell's position or reluctance to condemn his actions. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, despite his professional embarrassment over the incident, acknowledged under cross-examination that Mitchell had been an exemplary soldier whose concerns about veteran welfare were legitimate and widely shared. Even some of the soldiers who had been present at the ceremony admitted that they had found Mitchell's words compelling, though they had been shocked by his methods. The turning point in the proceedings came when Major Caldwell called an unexpected witness, General Sir Robert Pemberton, a retired chief of the General Staff whose military career had spanned 4 decades and whose reputation for integrity was unquestioned. Pemberton had not been scheduled to testify, and his appearance caused a sensation in the courtroom. His testimony would prove to be the most significant moment in the entire trial. "I have known Sergeant Major Mitchell for 15 years, General Pemberton testified, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I have served in combat alongside him, and have observed his leadership in both war and peace. He is one of the finest soldiers I have had the privilege to know, and his actions at Windsor Castle, while regrettable in their timing and manner, reflect a moral clarity that our military leadership would do well to emulate rather than punish." The general's testimony went far beyond character reference. He spoke about his own growing concerns regarding the treatment of military personnel by political and royal authorities, describing a pattern of neglect and indifference that had persisted for years. He revealed that he had privately raised similar concerns with government officials and royal household representatives, only to be dismissed or ignored. Mitchell's public stand, he suggested, had accomplished what years of private diplomacy had failed to achieve, forcing a national conversation about the true state of military-veteran relations. "The question before this court," General Pemberton concluded, "is not whether Sergeant Major Mitchell violated protocol, which he clearly did, but whether his violation was justified by the moral imperatives that should guide military service. If we punish soldiers for standing up for their comrades and for the principles they have sworn to defend, we risk creating a military that is technically proficient but morally hollow." The prosecution attempted to limit the damage from Pemberton's testimony by emphasizing that even distinguished officers could not authorize individual soldiers to ignore lawful orders or military protocol. Colonel Thornbury argued that accepting Mitchell's defense would essentially eliminate military discipline by allowing every soldier to claim moral justification for disobedience. The slippery slope argument had legal merit, but it seemed weak in the face of the specific circumstances and Mitchell's unblemished record. As the trial proceeded, it became clear that the proceedings had transcended their original scope and become a referendum on broader questions of military values and royal authority. Media coverage was intense and generally sympathetic to Mitchell, with public opinion polls showing significant support for his position. Veterans organizations issued statements calling for clemency, while serving military personnel found ways to express solidarity despite official prohibitions on political activity. The most dramatic moment came when Major Caldwell announced his intention to call King Charles III as a witness, arguing that the monarch's alleged comments about veteran welfare were central to understanding Mitchell's motivations. The request caused an immediate uproar, with the prosecution objecting vehemently and the court recessing to consider the unprecedented constitutional implications. The idea of compelling royal testimony in a military court-martial raised questions that had never been addressed in British law. During the recess, intense negotiations took place between the royal household, government officials, and military authorities. The palace was desperate to avoid having the king testify, knowing that any appearance would inevitably focus attention on the specific allegations that had motivated Mitchell's defiance. Alternative solutions were explored, including the possibility of a negotiated resolution that would allow Mitchell to accept a reduced punishment in exchange for dropping his request for royal testimony. Mitchell, however, refused to negotiate. He had already sacrificed his career and his family's security for the principle involved, and he was unwilling to compromise on the central issue that had driven him to act. If the king's comments about veterans were indefensible, he argued, then they should be exposed to public scrutiny. If they were defensible, then the king should be willing to explain and justify them under oath. The court ultimately ruled that royal testimony could not be compelled in a military court-martial, a decision that was legally sound but politically damaging to the prosecution's case. The ruling reinforced Mitchell's argument that the monarchy operated under different rules and standards than ordinary citizens, including the military personnel who swore to defend it. The image of a king protected from accountability while a decorated soldier faced ruin for speaking truth to power was politically potent and difficult to counter. As the trial moved toward closing arguments, both sides understood that they were participating in something far larger than a simple court-martial. The verdict would send a message about the relative importance of institutional loyalty versus individual conscience, about the accountability of unelected authorities, and about the true meaning of military service in a constitutional monarchy. The weight of that responsibility was visible in the faces of the court members as they prepared to render a judgment that would be remembered long after the participants had left the service. The verdict came on a gray November morning that seemed to mirror the somber mood within the courtroom. After 3 days of deliberation, the 5-member court panel filed back into their seats with expressions that revealed nothing of their decision. The tension in the room was palpable, with spectators from across the political and military spectrum holding their breath as they waited to learn the fate of the man who had dared to challenge royal authority. Brigadier James Hartwell, the senior member of the court, rose to deliver the verdict, with the measured cadence of a career officer who understood the historical significance of the moment. His voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as he began to speak. Sergeant Major James Mitchell, this court finds you guilty of conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline, in violation of Section 69 of the Armed Forces Act. However, this court also finds that the circumstances surrounding your actions warrant extraordinary consideration. The mixed verdict sent a ripple of confusion through the assembled observers. Guilty, but with conditions? The legal precedent was unclear, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing the creation of new jurisprudence in real time. Mitchell himself showed no emotion as he listened to words that would define the remainder of his life. Brigadier Hartwell continued, his voice growing stronger as he explained the court's reasoning. While your refusal to render proper respect to His Majesty was clearly in violation of military protocol, this court recognizes that your actions were motivated by genuine concern for the welfare of military personnel and veterans, concerns that have proven to be well-founded and widely shared throughout the armed forces. Your service record is exemplary, your character is unquestioned, and your commitment to the principles that make military service meaningful is evident. The courtroom stirred as people began to realize that this would not be a simple conviction and punishment. The court was clearly struggling with the same moral complexities that had driven Mitchell to his desperate act, and their verdict would reflect that struggle. Therefore, Brigadier Hartwell announced, while this court cannot ignore the legal violation that has occurred, we sentence you to reduction in rank to staff sergeant, forfeiture of 6 months' pay, and a reprimand to be entered into your service record. However, we also recommend that you be immediately transferred to a position within the Ministry of Defense Veterans Affairs Office, where your experience and advocacy can be put to constructive use in addressing the very issues that motivated your actions. The sentence was unprecedented in its combination of punishment and reward, condemnation and recognition. Mitchell would face consequences for his breach of discipline, but he would also be given an opportunity to continue serving in a capacity that aligned with his demonstrated concerns about veteran welfare. The court had essentially created a new category of military justice, one that acknowledged the difference between destructive rebellion and principled dissent. The reaction to the verdict was immediate and intense. Veterans organizations hailed it as a victory for moral courage and accountability, while traditionalist military voices condemned it as a dangerous precedent that would encourage future challenges to lawful authority. The media coverage was equally divided, with some commentators praising the court's wisdom and others warning about the erosion of military discipline. For Mitchell himself, the verdict represented a complex form of vindication. He had been found guilty of the charges against him, which preserved the principle of military discipline. But he had also been given a platform to continue the fight that had motivated his original act. The transfer to Veterans Affairs was more than just a job reassignment. It was an acknowledgement that his concerns had been legitimate and deserved institutional attention. The royal household's response was carefully calibrated to minimize further damage while maintaining the appearance of dignity. A brief statement acknowledged the court's verdict and expressed hope that all parties could now move forward in the best interests of military personnel and the nation. Behind the scenes, however, King Charles was reportedly furious about the mixed verdict and the implicit criticism of royal attitudes toward veterans. Palace officials began quietly reviewing procedures for royal interactions with military personnel to prevent future embarrassments. The broader consequences of the Mitchell case extended far beyond the immediate participants. Within weeks of the verdict, the government announced a comprehensive review of veterans' services, including increased funding for mental health programs and housing assistance. Several senior military officers who had privately supported Mitchell's concerns were promoted to positions where they could influence policy, while others who had been most vocal in their condemnation found their career prospects dimmed. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on military culture itself. Mitchell's case had forced a conversation about the nature of military duty that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. Young soldiers, in particular, began to view their service differently, understanding that they had both rights and responsibilities that extended beyond simple obedience to authority. The concept of moral courage was formally incorporated into military training programs, with Mitchell's case studied as both a cautionary tale and an example of principled leadership. Mitchell's new position in Veterans Affairs proved to be perfectly suited to his skills and passions. Working with a small but dedicated team, he helped to develop new programs for veteran employment, housing assistance, and mental health support. His insider knowledge of military bureaucracy, combined with his credibility among veterans, made him an effective advocate for reform. The man who had been court-martialed for challenging authority became an official voice for change within the system he had refused to bow to. His family gradually adapted to their new circumstances. Sarah returned to teaching, finding that the publicity surrounding her husband's case had made her something of a celebrity among colleagues who admired his stand. Robert completed his service with the Parachute Regiment and chose not to re-enlist, instead pursuing a career in veterans advocacy inspired by his father's example. The family had paid a significant price for Mitchell's moment of conscience, but they had also discovered reserves of strength and purpose they had not known they possessed. The friendship networks that had sustained Mitchell throughout his military career proved to be equally important in his new role. Former comrades reached out to share their own stories of struggle and frustration, many of them expressing gratitude that someone had finally given voice to concerns they had long harbored. The network became an informal intelligence system that helped Mitchell identify systemic problems and develop targeted solutions. 3 years after the confrontation at Windsor Castle, Mitchell was invited to speak at a veterans conference, where he found himself sharing the platform with General Sir Robert Pemberton, whose testimony had been crucial to the court-martial outcome. The two men had become friends and collaborators, working together to push for continued reforms within the military establishment. Their partnership represented a new model of military leadership, one that valued moral courage alongside tactical competence. During his speech, Mitchell reflected on the events that had transformed his life and career. "I did not set out to become a symbol or a spokesman," he told the assembled veterans and military families. "I simply reached a point where I could no longer participate in a system that demanded my respect, while showing contempt for the people I had sworn to protect." The consequences were severe, but they were also necessary. Sometimes the only way to serve your country is to challenge the people who claim to lead it. The audience's response was overwhelmingly positive, with many veterans approaching Mitchell afterward to share their own stories and seek advice. His transformation from disciplined soldier to principled advocate had given hope to countless others who felt trapped between their loyalty to the military and their concerns about its leadership. As Mitchell drove home that evening, past the same countryside where he had once stood guard over royal ceremonies, he reflected on the strange twists that had brought him to this moment. His career had taken a path he could never have imagined, but he had found a purpose that felt more meaningful than any ceremonial duty. The man who had refused to bow had discovered that there were forms of service more important than submission, and forms of loyalty more valuable than obedience. The final chapter of the story was written 5 years later when Mitchell was awarded the Order of the British Empire for his services to veterans' welfare. The irony was not lost on anyone present at the ceremony, including Mitchell himself, who accepted the honor with the same quiet dignity he had shown throughout his ordeal. In his brief acceptance speech, he paid tribute to David Thompson and the countless other veterans whose sacrifices had motivated his stand. The royal who presented the award was not King Charles, but rather the Princess of Wales, who had taken a particular interest in veterans' issues and had worked closely with Mitchell on several reform initiatives. Her genuine warmth and knowledgeable questions about his work suggested that the monarchy had learned important lessons from the crisis Mitchell had precipitated. As he left the ceremony, medal in hand and family by his side, James Mitchell understood that his refusal to bow had ultimately led to a different kind of recognition, one based on achievement rather than deference, on moral courage rather than institutional compliance. He had lost a career but found a calling, sacrificed a comfortable position but gained the respect of those whose opinions mattered most to him. In the end, the man who would not bow had taught an entire nation new ways to stand tall.